Well, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, excuse me, whatever time you might be watching this. We are really glad to have you watching Sunday School here at the Cross, and I appreciate you investing some of your time to watch this. Remember that our whole question for the class is it true? That is the gospel true? And we have begun with question number 1, is what we have, what they wrote. And we determine, yes, we can be certain that what we have is what they wrote. The second question was, did they believe what they wrote? And we determined through the death of Peter and Paul that if they had not believed what they wrote, then they wouldn't have died for it. And so now we come to the third question, because sometimes people believe things that aren't true. And we want to ask the question, did the resurrection, which is the keystone for Christianity? Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, the resurrection chapter, says, if the resurrection didn't happen, let's eat, drink, and be merry, because there's no real reason to go on living. The French or Algerian existentialist philosopher Albert Camus said it even more starkly. He said, the only thing that man has to decide is whether or not to commit suicide. And without Christ, that really is the only question that we have. If we believe that Christ died and was resurrected, then we have hope in the midst of a pandemic, in the midst of unemployment, in the midst of horrible racism. We still have hope in the God who one day will set everything right. If there was no resurrection, then we don't have that hope. So I want to begin today by making sure that we're not using bad arguments. One of the things that is problematic is that sometimes Christians repeat arguments that they've heard, sometimes from good people, but they're not exactly true. And so we want to go through a couple of those. We talked about one of them a couple of weeks ago when we said we are not certain that all 12 of the disciples of Jesus died a martyr's death except for John. We can't be sure of that. Today, I want us to look at something that is very often used by apologists as evidence for the resurrection, but I'm not sure that it's as strong as it might first appear. And that is the Shroud of Turin. I'm sure that all of you, at one time or another, have heard of the Shroud of Turin. These are just a few of the books that have been written about the shroud. If we were to take all the books that had been written about the shroud and put them on a shelf, they would be longer than the Babylonian Talmud. There have been dozens and dozens of books written about the shroud. There have been archaeological evidence argued over the shroud. Here we see from this is a journal called Biblical Archaeology Review, shortened to BAR, and it had several articles about the shroud and whether or not the shroud was real. There's also been in mainstream articles about the shroud. And the shroud, of course, is a cloth with the image of a person on it. And the Roman Catholic Church, of course, believes that the shroud is real. It's called the Shroud of Turin because of the fact that it resides at a church in Turin. And up toward the top of the slide, you can see that's the actual shroud. And you can see a variety of people bowing down and venerating this. This is the most holy of relics in the Roman Catholic Church, I believe. You can see here the Pope himself venerating the shroud that claims by some claims to have been the burial cloth of Jesus Christ. So let's ask a few questions, and let's make sure that we are all thinking in the same way so that we understand what the shroud really is. The shroud is thought to be the burial cloth of a crucified man, perhaps Jesus. So it is argued that the shroud has so many similarities with the injuries that Jesus would have had placed on him that it must be the burial shroud of Christ. The cloth itself is a strip of linen. It's one long strip. It's little over 14 feet long and about 3.5 feet wide. And it's housed in the Cathedral of St. John in Turin, Italy. It's opened up for people to see only once every few years. So it's not on display there every day that you can go in. Faintly visible, and I mean very faintly visible, on one side of the cloth are images of the front and back of a human body. So it's as if the shroud was laid down, the man was laid down on the shroud, and then the other part of it was rolled up over him. So the top of his head is in the middle of the shroud. That's why you have a front and a back image, and that's why it's 13 or 14 feet long. The body is that of a 5'11" to 6 foot, it's hard to tell exactly, but it's in that range, bearded male Caucasian weighing about 170 pounds. So that gives you a sense of what the body in the shroud was. This is essentially the front of the shroud. You can see the head and the face on the one side, and then the legs and the feet down on the other side, with the hands crossed in front of him, something like this. And this is only the front side of the shroud, so you're only getting one look. There's another part of the shroud that is the back of the crucified man. Here you see some veneration of the crowd, but also a group of people who are studying the shroud to determine its age, its viability as an ancient piece of cloth, all sorts of things like that. Now, one of the interesting things that was found only in the modern era is that when the shroud is photographed, it gives us an almost negative image of the person in the shroud. So here you will see on the one side what the shroud would look like if you just looked at it, and it's even lighter than that today. The image is fading. On the other side, in the darker image, you see what the image looks like if it were photographed, as it has been photographed. And so you can see that the photographic image of the shroud gives us a much more enhanced view of exactly what's going on there. It gives us a much more enhanced view of who the person was, of the injuries that he faced, of all of those kinds of things. Here's a photographic image of just the face of the man in the shroud. And you can see on the one hand, the actual shroud, it's hard to tell much. On the other hand, the photographic image, the darker image, seems to be much, much clearer, and you can see things that are very clear. So I want to, in trying to determine whether the shroud is a fraud, as some scholars claim, or was the real burial cloth of Jesus, as other scholars claim, I want to give you an attempt at being fair by showing you that the issue really comes down to a case of dueling experts, okay? There are experts that believe it is real and experts that believe it is a fraud. In terms of the experts who believe it is real, for every expert claim about the shroud, there's some other expert to dispute it. For every expert who says there's really blood on the shroud, there are other experts who say this is not blood on the shroud. For every expert who says the shroud is 2,000 years old, there's another expert who says the shroud is a fraud from the Middle Ages. And I will not tell you what to think of the shroud or make a decision for you. I'll try to present the evidence as fairly as I can, while it's impossible for me to be totally fair, as it's impossible for anybody to be totally fair, because I do have an opinion about the shroud. But I want you to think it through on your own. Of all the arguments from both sides that I'll show you today are from experts, either New Testament scholars or other professors or a variety of things like that. And so I'm trying to be fair as I present this supposed piece of evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. The reason it is seen as a very important piece of evidence for the resurrection of Jesus is that the claim is this image of the body must have been made by some kind of radiocarbon sort of thing, and that's probably what happened to the body of Jesus when he was resurrected, and that's the reason that the shroud is unique, that there aren't any other shrouds like this from the ancient world or from the medieval times. So let's just take a quick minute and see who believes in the shroud and who doesn't believe in the shroud, and that'll give you a sense of who the dueling experts are. You'll probably know most of these people. Dr. Kennedy was a very, very adamant believer in the shroud. He was very staunch, believed that the shroud was real and that it was the burial cloth of Christ. Gary Habermas, who is one of the greatest experts on the resurrection in the evangelical world, he has studied virtually everything written about the resurrection in English, French, and German. And so he is a great scholar of the resurrection. He teaches at Liberty University and is a debater defending the truth of Christianity. But he believes for certain that the shroud, I suppose he might hedge it a little bit, but he believes that the shroud was the burial cloth of Jesus. Dan Wallace, whom you've heard me mention before, is a friend of mine. He believes that the shroud is a burial cloth of Jesus. He wouldn't go so far, I think, as Gary Habermas as being certain, but he would say that the evidence is very strong that this was the burial cloth of Jesus. John A.T. Robinson was a liberal scholar who became more and more conservative as he got older. And he wrote a very famous book called Redating the Gospels, in which he dated the Gospels very early in a milieu that was dating the Gospels after the first century. He believed that the shroud was real. And that is one of the things that caused him to become more conservative and to become a Christian. Who then doesn't believe in the shroud? That if there are these, and these are, as you can see, these are people whom we would all respect, Who is it that does not believe in the shroud? D.A. Carson, great New Testament scholar, one of the finest New Testament scholars in evangelicalism, a wonderful professor and a teacher at Trinity Evangelical School, where I had him as a professor. He thinks the shroud is a medieval forgery, and he thinks that someone may have been crucified just to make the shroud in the Middle Ages. Mark Goodacre, a name that may not be as familiar to you, but he is also a great New Testament scholar who believes that the shroud is a medieval forgery. Gordon Clark, who was a philosopher, theologian, and he has written a variety of books. He had some unusual beliefs in terms of his own philosophy, but he very strongly argues that the shroud isn't true based on a passage of Scripture that I'll show you in a few minutes. J.I. Packer, I'm sure that you've all heard of J.I. Packer, and J.I. Packer is a great scholar, theologian, who does not believe that the shroud is real. And so we can ask ourselves, how is it that these men on both sides of the aisle are good men, honest men, men who love God, men who want to do the right thing? How is it that they can somehow come to the very opposite conclusion about whether or not the shroud is real? Well, one of the things that we have to be careful of is something that psychologists and statisticians call confirmation bias. And confirmation bias, essentially, it causes the investigator, instead of weighing all the evidence the same, and being led to whatever conclusion it is, it causes he or she, whoever is doing the work, it causes them to start with a conclusion and then try to conform all the facts to the theory in a favorable way. That's what confirmation bias does. If you already have a conclusion in your mind, then you go looking for evidence to prove that conclusion rather than simply looking at the evidence and deciding one way or the other. So we have to watch for confirmation bias on both sides of this debate. It's a very, very significant problem in a lot of argumentation, and we have to be very careful about it. So the first question that we might ask about this so-called shroud of Jesus Christ is, what's the history? In terms of being in favor of the shroud's history can be traced back to very early. But it can only be traced back to very early if it's seen as this face cloth of Jesus. There are images, as you see in the slide, of a face cloth of Jesus, sometimes called the veil of Veronica. It was said that as Jesus was walking along carrying the cross, she walked out, wiped his face with the cloth, and his image stayed on there. That's not in the New Testament, it's just a legend. And so there are those who argue that what happened was the shroud was folded up so it was only the face of the man who could be seen, and that's the reason that we don't have any early evidence for the shroud being around. We don't have any of the church fathers mentioning the shroud. We don't have anything like that. All we essentially have is just this face cloth. In terms of Kahn against the shroud's history can only be traced back to the 12th century. That would be about 1355 or so. And this is a time of many, many fraudulent Christian relics. Martin Luther and John Calvin, we'll see later, had very, very strict and arguments against the manufacturing of these kinds of shroud. Therefore, the dating of the shroud in terms of Kahn the shroud was carbon-14 dated. And the carbon-14 dates to, and there were 3 different labs that did the carbon-14 dating. All of them come to a time from about 1260 to 1390, that is in the Middle Ages. So if we're going to depend upon the carbon dating, it comes from the Middle Ages. On the other hand, those who are in favor of the crowd will say that carbon-14 dating is not reliable, first of all. They will say the place where the carbon-14 dating was taking place, they cut off a little tiny piece of the shroud, and that piece that was a piece that was used for repair of the shroud. It was used for repair of the shroud after a fire. And so as a result, that piece that was repaired is going to be from the Middle Ages because that's when it was repaired. Others will say there's no proof that the piece of shroud that was cut away was newer than the rest. They will say those taking the samples knew exactly what they were doing, and they were very careful about it, and they didn't take it from a repaired place. Those in favor of the shroud will argue even if the carbon-14 dating is correct, even if they didn't take it from a place that was repaired, the shroud was once in a fire, in a metal box, and some of the metal dripped down onto the shroud, and it was damaged. You can see that if you look at the pictures of the shroud. And they will argue that that kind of fire causes carbon-14 to be incorrect. So there are other things that can be used to date the cloth, they will argue, and those are the things we ought to be using rather than carbon-14. One of the serious problems, I think, with the shroud is this passage in John 20:6 and 7. It says, "Then Simon Peter, who had been following him, arrived, and he went right into the tomb. He saw the strips of linen cloth lying there, and the face cloth which had been around Jesus' head, not lying with the strips of linen cloth, but rolled up in a place by itself." And so, those who do not believe that the shroud is legitimate will say very clearly here, John is telling us that he wasn't wrapped up in one piece of cloth like that there were different pieces of cloth that were around different parts of his body. Therefore, the shroud must be fraudulent. Those in favor of the shroud will say the pieces mentioned are in addition to the shroud. That is, they put the shroud on him, and then they tied the shroud around with other pieces of cloth. And the piece around the head, they say, would be a piece that was meant to keep the jaw closed against the effects of rigor mortis. It wasn't a piece that was over his face. So again, you have the case of dueling experts. One of the really interesting things that has been put forward by a man named Dr. Allen and his wife, Mary Wanger. He is a medical doctor. I've heard him speak on a number of occasions and seen his presentation. He argues that there are a variety of things that you can see in the picture of the shroud if you look carefully. The chief piece that he sees is a coin in the eye from the time of Jesus. If there is a coin on the eye from the time of Jesus, that certainly increases the likelihood that the shroud is real. But what's the problem with the coins in the eyes? One is, this is from a photograph of a second generation photograph that was made in 1931. A second problem is that Dr. Wanger, if you ever see his I don't think he's alive anymore, but if you were to have seen his presentation, he would say that there are flowers that you can see on there, that you can see the whip that whipped Jesus, that you can see the nails, that you can see the thorns, that you can see the sign above the cross. So the shroud becomes almost this Rorschach test that you can see whatever you want to. These are Roman coins with the inscription of Caesar. it seems likely that if they were going to put coins on the eyes of Jesus, they would have used a Jewish coin. But much more important than any of this is that coins on the eyes was a pagan custom. It was a pagan custom so that the person who died could pay passage for the person who was taking him across the river Styx, the river of death. They needed to pay the boatman. That's why they put the coins on the eyes. There have been a variety of different ways of thinking about the shroud. The shroud is one of the most studied objects in the history of the world, and so those who are in favor of it will say it's the most studied object in the history of the world, and yet it cannot be duplicated. Against that, I will say the Patterson-Gimlin film is the second most studied home movie in the history of the world, and yet it can't be duplicated. If you don't know what the Patterson-Gimlin film is, it is the classic, quintessential film of Bigfoot, made by Roger Patterson and Gimlin. And certainly, I don't think there are many of us who think that Roger Patterson really filmed Bigfoot that day. And yet, many people have tried, but they have been unable to make anything like a duplicate of that film. So simply because it can't be duplicated doesn't mean that it's necessarily real. In terms of photographic images of the shroud, you can see here it's very difficult to look and see that there are really images of coins there. Some have argued that there are different kinds of flower on the shroud, different kinds of flora that only occurs in Jerusalem, and thus they claim that the shroud must have come from that area. The truth is, it proves nothing more but that at best, the shroud made a trip to Israel, or that somebody went to Israel, got those flora, and put them on the shroud. A man named Max Frey is responsible for these claims, and there are many scholars who claim that he is not to be trusted. The blood on the shroud, they will argue, the pro will argue, that there are real signs of blood on the shroud, and that the most recent tests show us that it's real blood. And they say the blood is exactly what we would expect from a crucifixion victim. On the other side, there are those who will say the blood, when tested, tests negative for actual blood. So again, we have dueling experts and dueling tests. And they say if it is blood, it seems to have run uphill because it starts at the bottom of the image and goes upward. Why would the blood be running uphill? There are a variety of other issues. The wounds in the wrist rather than the hand. We now know that was probably the way that people were nailed to a cross. We didn't know that then, and they didn't know it in the Middle Ages. That this was a cap of thorns rather than what we think of as a crown is what is shown on the shroud, and now we think that's probably correct. The photo-negative image of the shroud and the subtlety of the image. It is argued that if you were going to make an image like that, why in the world wouldn't you make it much more clear? In the Qumran, we have a 6-foot-tall Jesus in an era when the average height of a person was about 5 to 5'2". Yet never in anything is Jesus mentioned as being exceptionally tall. The arms and the fingers are exceptionally long. It's just, if you go back and look at the slide, you'll see the arms and the fingers are much longer than they should be. And that the right arm seems to be longer than the left arm. But more significantly, the New Testament never mentions the shroud, and the early church fathers never mentioned the shroud. And that's really, really significant. So we come to the end here and we ask ourselves, what does it matter? Our trust is in the Scripture and not in relics. We do not need the relics to show us what is true and what isn't true. Our hope is in the Lord and not some piece of cloth that he may have left behind. The truth or falsity of the shroud is really not a matter of Christian doctrine. Whether you want to believe that the shroud is true or whether you want to believe that the shroud is false, it's not a matter of Christian doctrine. The shroud is an object in the Roman Catholic Church of veneration. They worship it. You can see here the lines of people who are waiting to go into the church at Turin when the shroud is on display. Thousands and thousands of people are waiting for hours just for a chance to walk in front of it and bow their head. Here's what Martin Luther had to say about relics. He said, "It is of no value to formulate articles of faith on the basis of the works or words of the Holy Fathers. Otherwise, their food, clothes, houses, etc., would also have to become articles of faith, as has been done with relics. This means that the Word of God and no one else, not even an angel, should establish articles of faith." Here's what Calvin says on relics. He says, "As to the charge when they bring against us for discarding images as well as bones and relics of saints, it is easily answered. For none of these things ought to be valued more than the brazen serpent." And here, a more modern voice, Tim Keller from our own denomination, says, "Real Christianity is to meet the risen Lord. It's not just the apostles who have met the risen Lord. Anyone who's a Christian doesn't need to go to the tomb because you have him. You don't need a relic. You have him. You have a relationship. So whether you decide that the Shroud of Turin is real or whether you decide that it's false, I hope that you will refrain from using it as an argument for the resurrection, because there are just too many doubts about it. We'll look at a couple of other things like this that we shouldn't use as arguments for the resurrection, and then we'll begin looking at some of the really true great arguments for the resurrection that are biblical in the next few weeks. Thanks so much for watching. I hope that the Lord has blessed you, and I hope that this Cross Community Church will be a place where you can gather together and be blessed by the Lord. We'll see you next week.